Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. This season, we're having sweaty conversations for change. We're talking with guests about uncomfortable conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion needed to pivot towards positive change. We do this podcast because it's important that all voices are heard, all people are seen, and all people feel a sense of belonging in their workplaces. Let's meet this week's guest. Thank you so much for being back here on the podcast. We're going to talk today to Asif Sadiq, and he is a Senior Vice President at Warner Media for Equity and Inclusion International. He was previously the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Adidas and has a long, rich career in diversity and the inclusion space with senior executive roles at the Telegraph Media Group, EY Financial Services, and the City of London Police. So we're not going to have any shortage of content to talk about today. He's worked across many continents: Europe, North America, South America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and has been credited with impactful global equity, diversity, and inclusion activities and programs across these organizations to create a really strong sense of belonging, which is something we love to talk about here on the podcast. He's also a multi-award winning diversity and inclusion expert with a proven track record in D&I, sustainability, and social impact, and has been one of the most influential global D&I leaders by Hive Learning. So excited to talk with you today, Asif. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Julie.
Well, we always love to start with a candid conversation. I imagine the years that you've experienced the trenches with this DEI work, you probably had lots of them. If you had to pick one moment that speaks to you that our listeners could resonate with, when has a conversation gotten sticky or, hard, and how do people navigate? How have you navigated these conversations in your career?
Definitely. And there's so many that come to mind in the last 20 years. But I think probably the time when it was probably the most difficult was at the beginning of my career, and I was still in policing then. And I remember conversations at the time around some of the threats that we faced, which was around terrorism, and how conversations, unfortunately, at the time revolved around who we need to focus on. And it was usually the Muslim community. We need to tackle extremism, terrorism, and people wouldn't say the right thing, or they would stereotype and assume it's one homogenous group of people, and it was tough, right? Like, you hear this, and you hear things like, hey, that person looks Muslim or sounds Muslim, and I'm like, who looks Muslim? Like, what does a Muslim look like? I mean, as far as I'm aware, they're all different, like whether they're Arab, African, Caucasian, white, I mean, anything. And I remember hearing those conversations. This was after really after the sort of rise of terrorism in the UK, which was after 7/7, our big sort of terrorist attacks. And it was very uncomfortable, because I knew it's not right, and what I hear. And initially I made the decision not to say anything, because you don't want to, rock the boat too much. You don't want to be singled out and so on. But the more and more I heard the terminology and this sort of stereotype of the community, I felt it was important to educate and stand up. So I made that plunge to have the difficult conversations. And I did it in a way that I knew I didn't want to be a victim, because I knew people will then automatically assume that I'm only angry or I'm only upset because I'm a victim. And I do, represent the community as well. So I pitched it in a way that it was coming from the organizational perspective. So what I did say, and I still remember this, was that, hey, we need to really define what we mean by this, because people will misinterpret what we're saying, or it doesn't really classify what we're trying to achieve. And I remember having a conversation with a senior officer where he was like, what do you mean? And I explained, but I never let it be from my perspective. I pitched it from either community perspective or the organization's perspective. And it was a very tough conversation, very uncomfortable for both me and the individual, because in the end, he asked me, what's your perspective? And I was like, wow, this is what I didn't want to answer, and this is what I didn't want to say. And then when he asked me my perspective, I said it. I said, look, I think it's it's very wrong to use those kind of those terms or that language, because this is what I believe. I'm like, would you say I'm one of those people who needs to be stopped? And he's like, no, you're one of us. And I'm like, well then. So that's the challenge. And I mean, we resolved it, and we addressed some of the language, but I guess it took a lot to stand up to that, but also even more to have that uncomfortable conversation, not for the individual, but for me as well.
I love how you did that from a community perspective, right? Because yeah, oftentimes if we go into it, it's about me. And like you said, then you get labeled the victim, and then you get all this like sympathy. And like that's not what you're looking for. That's not the goal. The goal is to change the conversation and to see the uniqueness of the Muslim community, like the vast array of differences. You know, I can't imagine someone being like, well, that looks like an American. I mean, I guess you could stereotype and probably pinpoint one abroad, but like that just isn't something that would probably happen to me, nor would it be said likely in a derogatory way. So I think it's a really good window into your world. And I would guess that was probably a catalyst for a lot of more conversations later in your career. Because once you have that one hard conversation, I think it becomes easier to have more. As if I know you're really passionate about talking about systems and the systems, you know, of racism, of sexism. I mean, the list goes on, and you're in the media industry. You know, I just would love to know more about, if I'm just this individual person, right? Like, what do I do to drive change? Like, yeah, I could be an activist, and I could protest, and I can use my voice, but like, I think where allies are really struggling is to garner that community perspective, especially within businesses that find that that's political or that's in your personal life, which, you know, it's just a smeltering of everything right now. But I'd love to know more about how you approach systems and the role you think corporate has in addressing systems for change.
Definitely. So I think the first big thing is, I mean, we're all activists, right? Each and every one of us has an element of activism in what we believe in. I think what's critical is, how do we translate that activism into something meaningful, or into something which sort of speaks the language of the business? Now, that's not dismissing how important it is, or why you should be championing it. It's just translating it to a language that the business understands and the business sees what their role and responsibility within that is. And that's where you start getting change, because then you're speaking their language. There's no reason to dismiss it, or to see it not as being critical to what the organization believes in. Furthermore, I think one of the big pieces is for corporates, and this is speaking to, you know, the corporate organizations, they can't afford to say that what happens in society is not something that has an impact on them. You know, we know the last, I keep on saying 18 months, but I think it's 2 years of lockdown and racial justice and so many different elements have proved that, you know, our lives are very intertwined. You know, I can't remember this notion of 9 to 5 ever, right? Like, it's work life is like one, like there's so many things built into it. So therefore, what's important to people externally will also reflect in what they believe in internally within an organization. Furthermore, generational change means young people will not join an organization that does not value or believe in what they believe in. And you know where this really came to light, Julie, was a couple of months, probably about 7-8 months ago. I was speaking to some students in sixth form, which would be sort of 17, 18-year-olds, and it was about careers at Adidas. So I thought, you know, great, easy sort of pitch. I'll go there, 200 students, they're going to love it, great brand. You know, they're going to want, everyone's going to be asking, where do they sign up? And I went and I spoke to them about careers, and I was like, so any questions? And the questions were so challenging. Every single question, it was around sustainability, social impact. What is Adidas doing about this? What is Adidas doing about that? Like, really, really challenging questions. And basically what the questions were all centered around the fact that unless you're doing stuff around sustainability, inclusion, creating equity, social impact, we would not join you. And I was like, wow, so no longer can you rely on just a brand. People will only join, or younger generations will want to join an organization that values the things they value, which is so different to my time, you know, without giving away my age. But, you know, when I started my career, I just wanted a job, any job, could have worked anywhere. But now different generations will view things differently. And that also has an impact on consumers. Consumers have a choice. Consumers will choose a brand, a service, a provider that aligns to their values. And those values will span across equity, inclusion, social impact, sustainability, the whole piece. So unless brands can start living and breathing that in a way that they can impact it. So what I'm not saying, and because there'll be a number of people in businesses who might be listening to this who'll be like, well, but we can't save the world. No one's asking anyone to save the world. What people are asking companies to do or organizations to do is impact the world through your lens, through what you can impact and the change you can drive. I currently, as you know, work for Warner Media. We are trying to impact the world through what we do, through the things we create, through our channels. That's the way we can bring difference in our society and really align to what people believe in.
Yeah, I'm curious about the media industry, using that as an example, because there is low representation of women in a lot of aspects. Protagonists are overwhelmingly white men in media. Um, and yeah, people of color can be depicted, of course, aligned with stereotypes. So I'm curious if you use media as an example for our listeners to understand how to drive systemic change within like the realm, within your sphere of influence, because people aren't asking to like stand up and like change climate change. I mean, you could, right? But I think sticking to where you have expertise, where you have influence, probably makes more sense.
Of course. And again, like, I mean, in my case, it is the media, but no matter what industry you work in, you impact something where you engage with people. So if there's any company who doesn't sell anything to anyone and only operates internally, which is not possible, they're the only ones who can't do anything for impact. Everyone else has a role to play within what they do. More specifically within the media and broadly speaking, I think there's numerous things, right? So number one, of course, it's about representation on screen, but that representation in an authentic way. That's the critical piece. The amount of times I hear misrepresentation or not authentically representing communities or stereotyping groups of people, that's what we need to move away from. That's what we need to address and make sure that we're telling stories in a way that it's, again, authentic to those groups. So if we're talking about a same-sex couple, it should be the story of an authentic same-sex couple, how they would live it, not what I would think or someone who doesn't have that lived experience. And that's where we need to really drive change within that. And I guess further than that, it's also about, just not, and when we talk about representation, this is where one of the things I talk about a lot in diversity and inclusion is we need to go beyond box ticking. It's not good enough to say, whether it's internally that we have X amount of women in our workforce or X amount of people of color. If they're not happy, if they don't feel included, if they can't be their authentic self, if they don't have psychological safety, what's the point? It's just a number. And the same goes with what we do externally. So I think both elements are so important, but it is about allowing people to be that, whether you're representing them or whether they're in person, you need to allow them to be authentic to themselves.
Yeah. It reminds me of the concept of own voices. Making sure that the own voice, the lived experience of the person is really reflected in the story. And, I just recently started writing children's books about diversity because I realized this conversation needs to start much earlier. Originally a children's book author, an adult book author, but all that to say, I can't write about a kid of color's experience. That's not my lived experience. That's not fair. I'm going to have that danger of misrepresenting them perhaps, or that potential problem. So really architecting stories in a way that feels authentic to communities. And I love too what you said, Asif, about broadening beyond box checking, right? And you're talking about representation, but the diversity is the representation. The inclusion is like what we really need for people to stay. But I'm curious because I think most people go to race, gender, LGBTQ, disability. Those are usually the big four that I hear in my work. And I'm constantly challenging people to think, well, beyond though, there's so many different dimensions of diversity.
Exactly.
I'm curious as if, like, how do you look at that? How have you looked at that in your career, broadening those boxes?
Of course. So I think the first big thing is that, intersectionality means there's more to each and every one of us than one dimension, and especially the one visible dimension, because that's the box that you get placed into, right? So you join an organization or a company, whatever box you look like is then assigned to you for the rest of your career. And then every program, everything to like advance you is based on that. And I can go back in my career and, without naming the organizations, but I can think of programs which were like, like women's leadership programs, but then they were specific around, we need to give women confidence. And I'm like, wow, not every woman I know is not confident. Or similarly, how do we give people of color this skill or that skill? And those are the problems. Those are the challenges of boxing people by one characteristic. And I always look at this when I talk about intersectionality and what's important. I look at it from a personal perspective. Now, as of course, I'm a person of color, and a lot of people have conversations with me about that. Your struggles, your challenges. I mean, I've been this color since the day I was born, so it's not changed. And I've managed to navigate some of the challenges around that. What's been more difficult is managing young kids. I've got a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. Biggest challenge of my life, right? But no one talks to me about it because it's not what they see. I'm also neurodiverse. No one mentions that. No one ever touches that. No one talks about that. And this is where we need to get cleverer. We need to understand what are those different elements that make people up. I'm now getting older, so I'm getting into another age bracket, all those things. But these are things, neurodiversity, age diversity, 5 generations in a workplace, caring responsibilities, all these things. And the thing I always say is, yes, there's days my race is an issue, right? So there's days my race gives me a disadvantage. There's days it's my neurodiversity when I can't, when there's something I'm reading which is very complicated. There's days it's, my kids, which are, I've not slept and I'm having a hard day at work. So that's the truth of who we are as individuals. So once we start valuing that and understanding that, that's when we're going to start capturing that authentic identity, and it will mean something to people.
Yeah. You just did that so well with intersectional lenses of your own lived experience. I'm curious for leaders in the workplace that might find it hard to open up that kind of dialogue and learn about someone's neurodiversity or kind of the hidden aspects that they may not feel comfortable bringing to the table. I wonder, how do we create a workplace where people can have those honest conversations? Just like you said, caregiving is the biggest challenge right now. Race, exactly. Yeah, it's a factor. Neurodiversity, socioeconomic status, exactly. Too. I mean, exactly. There's all these layers to our humanity that I still feel like even in the world where we've had to adapt to learn so quickly and bring, like you said, our work and life together, I still feel like people hold those aspects about them back. They still don't feel like work is a place where I talk about those things. Have you seen ways to open up that dialogue?
Of course. Yeah. So, and you're 100% right. People do hold back, but that's because people are scared. We've created this, what I call the diversity and inclusion police, right? Where you can't say anything wrong. You can't ask anyone anything. And the problem with that is we're not doing what we as humans have grown up doing, which is exploring difference, understanding what makes people different, what's important to them. And I think a lot of times the challenge is we approach situations with stereotypes. So we've prejudged what we want as an answer, and we go into that situation with that answer in mind. So, we'll ask someone, where are you from? We already want to ask them, what's your ethnicity? What's your ethnic background? And I'm like, why don't you just ask, what's your ethnic background? I'm really interested to know your heritage or your cultural heritage. But we go in with, where are you from? And then in my case, if I say West London, I get them, no, where are you really from? And that's where the conversation gets difficult. But I think the challenge is, how do we ask with an inquisitive mindset, but without the answer in mind? Because that's where the challenge lies. And, you mentioned socioeconomic background, such an important factor, such an important area. But what I found with experience, people stereotype again. There's an assumption. Again, to give you another example, I was speaking at an event a couple of months back, and finished the event. This lady came up to me at the end, and she's like, "It's amazing to see everything you've achieved despite all odds." And I was like, "Oh, sure." I'm like, "What do you mean by all odds?" She's like, "It must have been really difficult growing up, struggling, not having access to opportunities." And I was like, "Wow." I'm like, firstly, I grew up in East Africa, Kenya, so I had private education throughout. I've been fairly privileged in my life. I'm like, and she, of course, I apologized. She's like, "Oh, no." But the problem was someone had told her, people like me, this is their background, this is what they do. And that's the problem. So if she had approached that situation by saying, "Oh, it's amazing to see what you've achieved. I'd love to know a bit more about your background," she would have known the reality rather than the assumption that she had. So I'm happy she asked the question, even though she got it wrong. But how can we ask the better question? That's the key thing. Because if you don't ask, you never learn.
Right.
But how do we ask better questions?
Yeah, and it's the curiosity versus judgment, just like with the where are you from? Where are you really from? It was the same kind of judgment. I want to put you in this box and test the assumption I have about you because people like you are not from here. People like you struggled. Like there's these assumptions and these stereotypes that often people don't even know. They're just testing those.
And
not really
it's not always negative, Julian. And I guess this is the other big thing, like, and I'm glad you mentioned it, that I think, even stereotypes in a positive way can have a negative impact. And that's such an important factor because sometimes we're doing it with the best of intentions, right? Best of intentions, but it goes wrong when we, again, get it wrong or it's not important to the individual. It's not a true reflection of what their identity is.
Yeah, it reminds me of the common microaggression, especially with women of color. Like, you're so articulate. That's
exactly.
positive, good intentioned compliment, but would you say the same thing about white man or insert someone else? If it doesn't make sense, it's probably not a good thing to say.
Exactly. I mean, the one I get a lot is, "Oh, your English is good."
Yeah.
And I'm like, I grew up speaking English. Like, if it wasn't, I'd be challenging my parents to ask, why is my English not good? Because they speak English.
Right.
So but it is that, because the assumption is I can't have grown up learning English or speaking English.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it is interesting. And, it's interesting, that assumption that was made about your socioeconomic background too. I can identify actually quite the opposite on that, as somebody that grew up, I wouldn't say poor, but just low disposable income, like single mom, small apartment, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when people see my white skin, they assume, right? They assume that like, oh, she was privileged. I went to, in this diversity there's no contest like who had the most diverse experiences, but it was, I think, different than what people think sometimes. And I struggle with framing that, because I don't want people to think I'm looking for sympathy or I'm trying to be a victim. It's really just a factor of my lived experiences.
Exactly.
I'm wondering, as if, translating this again to the workplace and what you've seen. You've been through so many amazing companies in their journey, and these companies, E&Y, Adidas, Warner, very, very laser focused on DEI. What could you say, like, that as far as best practices or things that work well for these global leaders, for our listeners to learn from your story?
Definitely. So I guess the biggest things have been, and I'll touch on some critical things which a lot of people focus on. One's where where we went from looking at like development just as mentoring, or people mentor women, or people of color and so on, to sponsorship. That was critical. So that's moving the dial. Because mentoring, I mean, you can tell me how great I am all day long, but unless you open doors for me, vouch for me when I'm not in the room, put me on the projects that are going to get me promoted, it's not going to help me. And that naturally, not that it's a negative thing, it happens for straight white men of a certain age group. That's naturally, and it's not, I'm not criticizing them, but it happens for them. It doesn't happen for others. So sponsorship was a huge thing. And these companies, this is going beyond the tick box D&I that they do, to actually, okay, so we need to create a sponsorship program and so on. Then training, and I say training, not with your one-off unconscious bias workshops and all that kind of stuff, because they really and truly don't change anything. But how do you embed a culture of learning? A culture of curiosity around learning. So people have a journey of learning, from experiential learning, create experiences, to self-taught learning, and all the sort of, different elements that people can share within themselves. Because the truth is, where I've seen the biggest shift is not with the big corporate things that you can put in your annual report that look really nice, shareholders love them. It's what you can influence on the day-to-day team level. And to do that, you have to make it personal to them. You have to make the conversations there. It can't be that you're speaking to them. You have to create that environment for them to have the conversations. And that's one of the things all these companies that I've worked for have done fairly well, where they've, rather than telling people what to do, they've created the environment for them to be able to tell each other what's important to them and what works. And of course, that I can, if we had more time, I would have gone into like what those programs look like and how they're put together. But I think the essence is taking that learning and growth around DEI onto the team level.
Yeah, and providing tools, providing information, providing some structure around it. Sponsorship in particular doesn't happen with that real, consistent, intentional approach because, like you
Exactly.
said, there's a certain demographic that usually benefits from sponsorship, but those are usually done behind closed doors. There's not a lot of
Exactly.
transparency. Same goes for team dynamics and facilitating that inclusive work environment. Yeah, Asif, this is so good. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with
No
us
problem.
today. I'm curious if our listeners want to follow your work, get in touch with you. I know we've been able to connect on LinkedIn, but are there ways that our listeners could connect and follow your work?
Sure, of course. Yeah. I mean, LinkedIn is probably my big point because I do share a lot of content on LinkedIn.
Good stuff. Good follow.
Yes. Yeah. That's probably my biggest place. But yeah, I mean, I do articles and other podcasts and things like that. So you can always find me online somewhere or the
Awesome.
other.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll be sure to link to your profile in our show notes so listeners connect and follow the ongoing journey of diversity and inclusion. And so thanks so much for joining the show today.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you again for having me. And if I can just finish on one last point, which I've been emphasizing for the past 12 months at least, which is that, when we view this subject or this topic, diversity isn't a problem that we're trying to solve. It is really an opportunity we need to embrace. And if we go in with that mindset, organizations, individuals, you'll just value it. And it's not an us and them game either. It's not this Robin Hood situation. We don't steal from one group and give to another. It benefits everyone. I promise you. One shift, one win, whether it be for one element of diversity, improves systems, improves structures, creates more equity for everyone. So, it's one of those things you must embrace. I almost talk about it as the technology of the past. And you can probably remember, Julie, when technology came in, people were a bit hesitant and so on. And then in the end, it's overtaken everything. That's the way I see equity and inclusion. So either you embrace it or you'll be left behind.
I love that. It's an opportunity, not a problem. I love the optimism there. Thanks so much for your voice in the world. And thank you for sharing such great information today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you're on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our new signature Lead Like an Ally online self-paced learning program. It's comprehensive and it includes an online learning platform packed with tools, stories, and ideas to become an even better ally. Head over to leadlikeanally.com to learn more.